What is the biggest challenge for someone like us who grew up in a culture very mentalistic, autonomous, all marks of Hellenistic and scientific standard approach? What the biggest challenge for us to deal with a brew approach to philosophy?
I think if I could be so bold, I would say the Hebraic approach to the Hebraic intellectual tradition. I'm not even married to the idea of philosophy, whatever that might be, but that the intellectual tradition, I think it's true. It is the reality that we live in. It is the correct interpretation of Scripture to some degree, or sorry, the correct interpretation of reality to some degree. So when David looks at Goliath and says, you know, you come at me with the weapons of war, but I come at you in the name of the army of Yahweh, he's correct in that interpretation. He sees something invisible that other people can't see, and he's right. And I think that extends into a lot of the way we think. It's the same thing with scientists, right? Who can see things in the world and they can say, oh, this is why this bird is acting this way, because they've studied them empirically over time. And it's something invisible to us. We're all looking at the same bird, but we don't understand why it's doing the thing that it's doing. And the scientist, she can look and she can say, this is what let me explain to you the invisible things that are going on here that are causing what is visible to you. So it's a very similar intellectual project that, again, explains more. It has more explanatory power than any other intellectual tradition in the world. So in one way, as Christians, and okay, this sounds horrible to say this, but we have to admit that that's actually true, that the biblical intellectual tradition is the best one. And I can hear any philosophers or philosophy majors out there just going like, no, the Bible's a great spiritual resource, but it can't be the best intellectual tradition. And I think we just we don't actually value it as the intellectual tradition to which we owe all of our best intellectual traditions today. That also means that we have to constantly remind ourselves through our practices that our intellectual practices should be communal, they should be embodied, right? So I'll have students or adults. I had a scholar who wrote a review of me and Jamie Smith's books, and he said, like, this is a professional theologian at an actual seminary, said, well, they're making this argument that the body matters for knowing the world correctly, but what about when I'm reading a book or watching a movie? I'm not doing anything with my body. I'm just sitting there doing nothing, and so therefore my body has nothing to do with whatever I'm thinking about. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, you clearly do not understand the body and the mind and, involved in movie watching, right? Like, you're sitting, you're even I'm sitting here, but I'm balancing myself. If I didn't balance myself, if I lost my sense of balance, I would fall out of the chair. If you've ever known people that don't have a sense of balance, it happens. And so there's this sense where we are kind of openly and hostile. We're hostile to the body. We're hostile to the social body, the mechanisms of the social body that teaches us. We're hostile to the idea that the goal is not to know everything, but the goal is to have appropriate understanding and wisdom and discernment to what God has called us to. And I feel like we've been engineered by culture and to think of ourselves, to think about, I'm going to learn. I mean, or hold up a book. I have students every semester that say, oh, I don't know if you know this word, autodidact. Have you ever heard this word? Autodidact?
Yes, we have this word.
And I'll always ask them, I'll say, well, they're always saying, I don't need to take this class. I'm an autodidact. Just give me the books. And I'm like, what do you think autodidact? I'm self-taught. I teach myself. I'm like, well, as soon as you're reading a book, you're not teaching yourself, right? This is somebody who spent dozens of years becoming expert and writing in such a way that you could follow along with what they were saying. So those little things that happen culturally and colloquially, the kind of resting disposition of the church is always like this fallacy that I can just teach myself, that a book is just data, that it's actually not a voice who I submit to, but it's just data that I can get into my brain as if we live in the Matrix. So you really have to openly resist that message at every corner. When I'm reading a book, I am inhabiting an embodied space in a social space where I am with somebody else, and it's a ritualized behavior. And when I read a book I'm listening to the voice of the author, but also that author comes from a whole community and tradition that I'm entering, and I need to be aware of what that tradition and community is. Like those basic disposition. I was in the military for 7 years, and a lot of what the military does with young men, stupid young men like myself, is they just try to make you aware of the kinds of things you should be thinking when you enter a situation. That you should always be, it's part of the problem too of being a combat veteran. You go into a restaurant and you're always looking for the exits. You always want to sit with your back against the wall so you can see everybody in front of you, right? I feel like we need to have those kinds of reflexes to the Enlightenment mentalism and individualism. And even when we argue with our spouse, right? If you get into this mode where me and my spouse don't argue that much, but when we do, I always do the same thing. I try to make an argument and then build the whole argument around the one thing that I think is logical, right? And what am I doing? I'm being like this autonomous argument person where like, no, this is the autonomous argument, failing to miss the fact that her and I are in a relationship where that argument is relative to what's going on between us. So like it should penetrate all the way down into the pastoral task, the family life, professional life, academic life, etc.
Fantastic. Very pastoral answer.